The world of amusement parks, with their flashing lights and colorful attractions, promises a thrilling escape from the mundane. They are places of joy and laughter, where the ordinary turns extraordinary, and where families gather to create memories that will last a lifetime. Yet, beneath the glittering veneer of these seemingly innocent parks, there lies a darker, more sinister truth. For every roller coaster that races through the sky, for every ride that spins and dips, there are whispers of tragedies, of lives lost in the pursuit of thrills. These stories are rarely told, the ones that don't fit into the brochure, the ones that are swept away by the winds of time. But those who were there, those who survived, know that there is something lurking in the shadows, something that waits in the places where the lights flicker and the tracks creak. Amusement parks, like all places of human invention, are not without their flaws. And sometimes, those flaws take the form of disasters that leave behind more than just physical scars. They leave behind stories of terror, of horror, and of a deep, lingering unease that hangs in the air long after the last screams fade away. In these tales, we will journey into the darkest corners of these once joyous places, where rides became tombs and where the thrill of adventure turned to nightmare. These are the stories of the haunted attractions, the malfunctioning rides, and the tragic events that transformed amusement parks into places where the dead still seem to whisper, where the thrill of the ride was only a mask for the horror beneath. So, fasten your seatbelt. The ride is about to begin. The horror of the Ride of Death, the tragic story of the Big Dipper at Dreamland. The crisp evening air had already begun to settle in when the old seaside park, Dreamland, opened its gates to another evening of anticipation. Its sprawling boardwalk, lined with neon lights and the distant sound of laughter, was a familiar sight to the locals who flocked to the park every summer. This park, located along the coast, held many attractions, but none more famous than the Big Dipper, an enormous roller coaster that towered above the park. Built in the early 1900s, the coaster had long been the crown jewel of Dreamland, attracting both thrill-seekers and tourists alike. But for all its grandeur and popularity, there was something unsettling about it, a sensation that visitors couldn't quite place, but always seemed to feel at its base, where the tracks twisted and turned into a web of rusted steel. As with all great theme parks, Dreamland promised an escape from reality, a promise that it kept, until the night it shattered. It was a quiet Friday evening when the accident occurred. The park was full of energy, families milling about, the sweet smell of popcorn and hot dogs wafting through the air. But one ride had a line that stretched for what seemed like miles, the Big Dipper. Every few minutes, screams of exhilaration rang out as the coaster's cars clattered through its wooden tracks, zooming down steep drops and climbing terrifying heights. The air around the coaster felt charged with excitement. Among the crowd that night were two friends, Jack and Sarah. They had been planning to come to Dreamland for months. Both of them were experienced coaster enthusiasts, having visited numerous parks in their short lives. The Big Dipper, however, had been a ride they had heard rumors about, the kind of ride that had been around long enough to have its fair share of whispered stories. Some said the ride was cursed, others claimed that it was just old and unsafe. But neither Jack nor Sarah paid any mind to such tales. They were just excited for the thrill of the drop. The moment they reached the front of the line, they could feel the tension in the air. The ride's operator, a man who appeared far older than his years, was a quiet figure in the shadows. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the safety bars for each rider, and there was an unsettling look in his eyes. Jack and Sarah didn't think much of it. Maybe it was the result of too many years working in a place like Dreamland. But as they climbed into their seats, Jack noticed something strange. The rust on the tracks seemed darker than usual, almost as if it had been soaked in something, something that wasn't just the wear and tear of time. But he shrugged it off. It was probably just his imagination. The Big Dipper was famous for its steep hill, the towering drop that seemed to defy all logic, as if the coaster itself was daring you to look down before plunging into oblivion. Jack and Sarah held on tightly, their excitement mounting with every passing second. The coaster began its slow ascent, clacking up the metal hill, the sound of the chains echoing eerily around them. But as they reached the peak, something felt off. The air seemed to grow still, and for the briefest moment, the ride stopped, hanging them at the very top, with the entire park below them a mere blur of lights. The feeling of being suspended there, between heaven and earth, was enough to make Sarah's stomach churn. The wind died, and the only thing she could hear was her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. A strange, almost oppressive silence filled the air. She turned to Jack to say something, but before she could open her mouth, the coaster jerked forward. The drop was nothing short of terrifying. The cars plummeted, the world spinning around them at dizzying speeds. But what followed next was unlike anything either of them had experienced before. As they flew through the twists and turns of the tracks, Sarah could hear something. A low, groaning sound, as if the coaster itself was struggling, a metallic screech that seemed to rise above the sound of the wind. The sensation in her chest became more pronounced, like the ride was no longer in control, like the coaster was fighting against its own tracks. Her eyes widened in terror as she realized something was wrong. She reached for Jack's hand, but he was staring ahead, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. Suddenly the car jerked violently to one side, sending Sarah flying against the safety bar. Her heart raced as she tried to hold on, her breath coming in short gasps. The track curved sharply, more so than she had anticipated, and she could hear the creaking of the wood, a deep, ominous sound that rattled her bones. The coaster felt unstable, unsafe. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the ride came to a screeching halt. The sudden stop was disorienting. The cars jerked again, and Sarah's heart dropped into her stomach. But something was wrong. Too wrong. The riders around them were frozen in place, their faces grim and confused, the excitement of the ride gone in an instant. The operator, a few yards away, stood motionless, his hands gripping the control panel. There was no movement from him, not a twitch, not even a blink. And then, as the riders began to notice something that no one had noticed before, a slow realization crept over them all. The air smelled strange, almost metallic, and the track below them, a section of it, a crucial part of the ride, appeared to have been weakened. The rust, the strange groaning, the bizarre sensation of falling. It all made sense. The Big Dipper was breaking down beneath them. The ride was no longer what it once was. Something had gone terribly wrong. Panic spread like wildfire. One by one, the riders began screaming, but no one came to their rescue. The operator was still motionless, his eyes locked on some unseen spot in the distance, his hands trembling. It was as if he had been frozen in time, unwilling or unable to save the passengers trapped on the ride. Then, a horrific sound broke through the stillness, the sound of the track snapping, splintering under the pressure. The entire structure shuddered, sending shockwaves through the air. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized that the end of the Big Dipper was fast approaching. With a deafening crash, the coaster buckled under the weight of its own age. The passengers were thrown into chaos, their bodies flung violently in all directions, the carriages tilting at impossible angles. The Big Dipper, once a symbol of adventure, had become a twisted wreck of steel and wood. In the aftermath, when emergency responders arrived, they found the wreckage of the Big Dipper. But more importantly, they found the survivors, shaken and broken, but alive. They spoke of the sounds they had heard, of the strange silence before the drop, of the twisted, almost sentient groans of the coaster itself. Those who hadn't survived were buried beneath the ruins of the attraction, their bodies twisted and mangled beyond recognition. The park was shut down shortly after the accident. The Big Dipper closed for good. Some say it was never truly a ride meant for this world. The land it was built on had a history of destruction, and the coaster had always been cursed. No one could say for sure, but the haunting of Dreamland began the moment the Big Dipper stopped operating, and to this day it is said that on quiet nights you can hear the echoes of the ride's final scream, and if you listen closely, you might even hear the operator's last whispered words. The Big Dipper's legacy lives on, through the dark, rusted remnants of its rails, and through the whispers of those who still remember the horror that unfolded on that fateful night. The lost souls of the twisted ride, the terrifying collapse of the haunted castle ride at Wonderland Amusement Park. There are places in the world that are never quite what they seem, where the shadows hide more than the light could ever hope to reveal. Wonderland Amusement Park was one such place. Situated on the outskirts of a small, sleepy town, the park seemed to hold an air of mysterious allure. It had been built in the early 1960s, just after the boom of the post-war era. With its towering Ferris wheel and neon-lit roller coasters, Wonderland was a dream come true for thrill-seekers and families looking for a weekend getaway. Among its most popular attractions, though, was the Haunted Castle, a dark ride that twisted through eerie corridors and crumbling rooms. Unlike other theme parks, Wonderland had its own particular brand of charm. The Haunted Castle was not just another ride. No, it was something more. Built as a haunted mansion attraction, it was designed to create the perfect atmosphere of dread. Fog machines filled the dark ride with a choking mist, while lifelike mannequins and sound effects created an illusion of a haunted house. People entered expecting a harmless thrill, but as they moved through the pitch-black rooms, there was an unshakable sense that something wasn't quite right. For years, the Haunted Castle had been a favorite for visitors. Families, teens, and couples would brave its terrifying corridors time and time again. But few knew the full story behind the ride. There were rumors among the employees, stories whispered by the staff who'd worked there for years. Some spoke of mysterious disappearances, others spoke of strange accidents, and a few even claimed that the ride had been built atop the grounds of an old cemetery. But these were just rumors, right? Just idle chatter. Nothing to worry about. Or so they thought. On the night of June 3, 1982, Wonderland Amusement Park was alive with its usual summer buzz. The smell of cotton candy and popcorn filled the air, and the sounds of children's laughter echoed through the park. But as night fell and the moon hung high in the sky, an eerie chill began to settle over the haunted castle. It was a Saturday night, one of the busiest nights of the summer, and the line for the haunted castle was longer than usual. The park's security cameras recorded faces full of excitement, eager to face the thrills that awaited them. Among the crowd were a group of 5 college friends: Lisa, John, Michelle, Kevin, and Sarah. They had come to Wonderland for one reason: to brave the haunted castle together. It was something they'd talked about for weeks, sharing stories of what they might see. Some of them believed the rumors. Lisa had heard whispers that the ride was haunted, that some riders had vanished mysteriously over the years. But the others dismissed her concerns, laughing it off as nothing more than superstition. The group entered the line, their excitement palpable. As they waited, they could hear the low moans and creaks of the ride as it wound through the dark, the fog spilling from the ride's entrance like a twisted invitation. The operator, a gaunt man with tired eyes, gave them each a nervous smile as they boarded the ride's small, rickety carriages. The doors closed behind them, the lights dimmed, and with a lurch, the ride began. As the car moved slowly through the first chamber, the friends exchanged nervous glances. The air felt heavy, strangely dense, and the faint sound of whispers filled the darkness. "Is this part of the ride?" Kevin whispered, his voice barely audible over the eerie moans of the ride's sound system. No one answered, but there was a noticeable tension in the air. The walls of the haunted castle creaked as if they were alive, groaning under the weight of time. But it was only when they passed the first mirror that they felt it. There, in the reflection, a figure stood. A woman, dressed in a tattered gown, her hair long and unkempt. She was standing perfectly still, a haunting expression on her face. But she wasn't part of the attraction. She didn't move, didn't blink. Lisa gasped, but before anyone could say anything, the ride jerked forward, pulling them away from the mirror. "What the hell was that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. The group was uneasy, but they tried to laugh it off as part of the ride's spooky ambiance. They continued on, passing through chamber after chamber, each one darker and more twisted than the last. But the strange feeling lingered. There was something about this ride that didn't feel right. The air was thick with fog now, and the friends could barely see each other in the darkness. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows on the walls, making them look like twisting figures from another world. And the further they moved into the ride, the more the sounds seemed to change. Groaning wood, whispering voices, and strange, inaudible murmurs that seemed to come from all directions. It was at the halfway point of the ride when things began to go wrong. The carriages, which had been moving smoothly until then, suddenly stopped. The friends glanced at each other, their faces lit by the dim, flickering lights. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the ride's creaking and the cold, still air. And then, without warning, the lights went out entirely. A deep, unsettling silence fell. In the pitch darkness, the friends could feel their hearts pounding in their chests. "What's going on?" Michelle whispered, her voice quivering. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed in the darkness, growing closer and closer, until they seemed to be right next to the carriages. Lisa screamed, her hand reaching for Sarah, but there was nothing there. The footsteps continued, the sound of slow, deliberate steps. And then, a whisper. A voice, soft but clear, that sent chills down their spines. "Leave now," it breathed. "You shouldn't be here." A gust of cold air swept through the carriages, freezing them to the bone. The ride jolted forward, suddenly lurching back to life as if it had a mind of its own. The friends screamed, but the darkness remained. The carriages flew through the rest of the ride's passages with an almost unnatural speed, twisting and turning through the rooms at breakneck pace. The walls seemed to close in on them, and the ride's sharp drops felt more like an impending fall into an abyss. The last thing they saw was the tunnel ahead, the entrance to the final chamber, and in that fleeting moment they saw her again. The woman, standing motionless in the corner of the chamber, staring at them with those hollow, lifeless eyes. She was no longer part of the ride. She was part of something far darker. When the carriages finally screeched to a halt at the end of the ride, the group was thrown forward, gasping for breath. But the horror was far from over. The ride operator was nowhere to be found, and the once bustling park had grown eerily silent. The fog lingered thick around the entrance, and when they looked around, they realized that they were the only ones there. As the friends stumbled out of the ride, they saw the park's maintenance crew hurrying toward them, their faces pale with fear. The haunted castle, it turned out, had experienced a catastrophic failure that very night, an electrical malfunction that caused the entire ride to short-circuit. The ride had been forced to stop in the middle of its course, trapping those inside. But even more chilling was the fact that the woman they had seen, her pale face and empty eyes, was not just part of the ride. She was the spirit of a woman who had once worked at the park and died mysteriously years earlier. Legend had it she had never left. her soul forever wandering the haunted halls of Wonderland. The park was closed immediately after that night, and the haunted castle was shut down for good. The reports of the incident were vague, and some said the entire attraction was demolished. But to this day, visitors to the park report strange occurrences, whispers in the dark, fleeting glimpses of a woman in a tattered gown, and the unmistakable feeling that the haunted castle was never truly abandoned. The souls trapped within it still linger, waiting. The dark ride of death, the tragic collapse of the Smiler, at Alton Towers. It was a summer day in 2015, and the air was thick with excitement as families and thrill-seekers flooded into Alton Towers, one of the most beloved amusement parks in the UK. The park was bustling, its iconic roller coasters towering high above, while the scent of fresh popcorn and candy floss mixed with the laughter of children. The centerpiece of the day's excitement, however, was the Smiler, the park's latest attraction, advertised as the world's first 14-loop roller coaster, the most twisted, most dizzying ride ever conceived. The ride was designed to disorient and thrill, to take riders through a series of intense loops and inversions that would leave them breathless. It was a marvel of engineering, a roller coaster like no other, one that promised a unique thrill every time, and the name, the Smiler, suggested a light-hearted, almost playful experience, as if riders would leave with a grin, their hearts racing with excitement. But in the days leading up to the ride's opening, something about the Smiler felt off to those who had worked on it. Rumors of malfunctions began to surface, but they were quickly dismissed, brushed away in favor of the park's desire to open it to the public. That fateful day on June 2, 2015, a seemingly perfect summer afternoon, a group of friends eagerly queued for their turn to experience the Smiler. Among them was a young couple, Dan and Becky, along with two of their friends, Harry and Emma. The four had been friends for years, united by their shared love of roller coasters and theme parks. For them, Alton Towers had always been a place of fun, a place where memories were made, where laughter was constant, and the thrill of a new ride was always just around the corner. They were no strangers to the Smiler. In fact, they'd been excited about it for months. As they entered the queue, the towering ride loomed above them, its twisting loops and sharp turns giving the impression that the track itself was alive, moving, waiting for its next victim. The ride, designed to be disorienting, also had a unique feature, a set of high-tech screens and mirrors that distorted the rider's sense of reality, giving the illusion of an endless loop, a journey into madness. Dan, always the brave one, reassured Becky, who had a small fear of roller coasters. "It'll be worth it," he said, his voice steady, but with an edge of excitement. The rest of the group, too, was eager to experience what they believed would be a fun and thrilling adventure. They boarded their seats, the metal harnesses clicked into place, and the ride began. The first few moments were exhilarating. The steep climb to the top of the track, the rush of wind in their faces, the stunning view of the park below. But then, as they reached the peak, something strange happened. There was a brief hesitation, almost imperceptible, but enough to make them all feel uneasy. It was as though the ride had momentarily stalled. But before anyone could voice their concern, the coaster plummeted downward, racing through the first loop with intense speed. The thrill was overwhelming. They screamed in joy, hands raised to the sky, bodies weightless for the briefest of moments. But then it happened. Without warning, the ride stopped. The sudden jolt sent everyone forward in their seats, their bodies thrust against the harnesses. For a brief moment, there was complete and utter silence. No sound of the chains, no hum of the coaster, just a stillness that was unsettling. The carriages had come to a halt, suspended in the air after completing just a few loops. For a few long moments, no one spoke. The ride had frozen, mid-air, its riders hanging there, suspended in time. It felt unnatural. It felt wrong. There was something about the way the ride had stalled that seemed deliberate, intentional almost. Dan and Becky exchanged anxious glances, but they said nothing. A deep, primal fear began to settle in. Then the whispers started. At first, they were barely audible, faint voices that seemed to come from all around them. The sounds of people murmuring, but not in any language they could understand. The noise seemed to grow louder, more insistent, until it felt like they were surrounded by an unseen crowd, their whispers brushing against the edges of their minds. Emma, who had always been the most courageous of the group, started to panic. "What's going on? Why aren't we moving?" she asked, her voice shaky with fear. The operator of the ride, unseen by the riders, attempted to restore the system. But despite his best efforts, something had gone terribly wrong. The carriages hung there in the sky, frozen and helpless, the park below a blur of lights and distant voices. Seconds turned into minutes, and still the ride remained frozen. Time seemed to stretch, as if the world had slowed down, as if they were trapped in an endless loop. Becky's hands clenched the harness, her knuckles turning white. "I don't like this," she whispered. "I don't like this at all." It was then that a piercing sound broke through the stillness, a high-pitched screech, the unmistakable sound of metal tearing. The carriages jerked forward violently, and before anyone could brace themselves, the entire ride plunged downward, twisting violently. The force of the fall slammed the riders against their restraints, their bodies pressed into the hard plastic seats. But something was wrong. The track itself seemed unstable, bending, creaking under the strain. The sharp bends that should have been smooth were jagged, as though the ride itself was fighting against its own design, struggling to stay together. As they plunged through another loop, the carriages rattled violently, the screeching of metal echoing in their ears. Dan and Becky's hearts raced, their minds clouded by a rush of panic. It was as if they were no longer riding a roller coaster at all, but trapped in some sort of twisted nightmare. They had no control, no way of knowing what was going to happen next. Then, as the ride entered its final inversion, the worst happened. The carriages, rattling and screaming, were jolted one final time as the track, one crucial section, snapped under the immense pressure. In an instant, the entire structure collapsed. The world went dark. When the emergency crews arrived, they found the wreckage of the ride, the twisted, mangled remnants of what had once been the Smiler. The group of friends was trapped, their bodies contorted in ways that were unimaginable. Becky and Dan, along with Harry and Emma, had been severely injured. Miraculously, they survived, but the trauma was immense, both physical and psychological. The once jovial park had become a place of terror and death. The investigation revealed that the Smiler had suffered from a series of malfunctions leading up to the incident. The ride's safety mechanisms had failed, causing the roller coaster to come to an abrupt halt. But what was more chilling was the discovery that the ride's design had never been properly tested. The track, which was meant to endure extreme stresses, had been weakened by repeated malfunctions, leaving it prone to failure. The accident led to the closure of the Smiler for good, and Alton Towers, once a haven of laughter and thrills, was forever marked by the tragedy. The park tried to move on, but the memory of the incident lingered. For those who had been there, who had seen the horrors unfold, the Smiler would never be just a roller coaster. It would be the ride that took more than it gave. To this day, visitors report feeling an eerie chill when they pass the site where the Smiler once stood. Some claim to hear strange sounds, a faint whirring of gears, the distant sound of a scream, but no one can say for sure. The dark history of the Smiler is now a part of Alton Towers' legacy, a reminder that some rides, no matter how thrilling they seem, are never meant to be conquered.